right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us in this breakout session where we're going to hear from some national climate journalists. So first I want to set a little bit of context for us since a lot has happened in climate news since we were last together. So climate turned into really a central element of the 2020 campaign, particularly with Biden's presidential run. And then in the early months of the administration and the 117th Congress, climate started to take center stage even more. And along the way, there were many twists and turns. We've sort of jokingly referred to it internally as the reconciliation roller coaster. So I'm hopeful that our discussion today with these journalists who followed all those twists and turns in their coverage will help us put it all into context and make more sense of how we arrived at this moment. So with that, I'll introduce our guests and then we'll get into it. So we have Maxine Joslow from the Washington Post, Josh Siegel from Politico, and Marianne Lavelle from InsideClimate News. So let's give them a warm welcome. All right. So I'd first like to start off with just a broad question, and all these questions can be for any of you, so feel free to jump in. But just generally, what do you remember about the early days of this administration and this Congress and how climate factored into their plans? Cast your mind back.
I can start. Yeah, sure. I mean, it was clearly for the administration, it was a top 4 priority. So they totally elevated. I think we saw pressure on Joe Biden during the primary. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. I know Jay Inslee's plans heavily influenced what Biden put out, and in this Congress as well. I think the Democratic-controlled Congress, it was clearly a top priority off the bat, and they made clear that Build Back Better was going to be a broad social agenda, but climate was a huge part of that, and these kind of overlapping crises, they saw climate as tying into a bunch of different issues. So yeah, I think it was clearly front and center from the start.
In a lot of ways, Biden came in a very similar situation to Obama coming in, with just kind of a mess on his hands to deal with. With Obama, it was the economic downturn. And in retrospect, there was a lot of criticism that Obama kind of left climate to after dealing with the economic stimulus. And what Biden's team really tried to do from the beginning, from before he took office, was to have a plan that dealt with the economic issues tied together with the climate issues. That's what the whole Build Back Better concept is, that we're not going to deal with them separately. We're not going to deal with them serially and put climate after. It's going to be all part of the same package. That was the idea anyway.
That's true. That was new to roll it all up together. Okay, so based on your coverage last year, actually, before I do the second question, let me remind everyone here, we will have time at the end to take questions from you. So if you want to, as we're having our discussion, if you have questions for these folks, feel free to write them on your index card. Someone will pick them up, and we'll take questions at the end. Okay, so based on your coverage last year, can you comment on how that focus on climate developed? And you're starting to get into that, Marianne, with they were combining the issues. But my sense is that it was central in the campaign. It was central at the beginning of the administration, the Congress, and then it just built and kind of reached a peak in the fall. But I just love your perspective on kind of how the year unfolded in terms of the climate conversation.
Yeah, I can jump in. I was quiet on the first question because it feels like so long ago. It just feels like it's been years, but we're talking about like months ago, right? It just, anyway, I think that you're right, that Flannery, that it kind of builded and just kept building and building. And I almost had the sense that every day there was a new bit of news about what Democrats on the Hill were planning for reconciliation. Again, it feels like years ago, right, that we all thought that the Clean Electricity Performance Program was going to be in reconciliation and that was going to pass. Then you had the clean energy tax credits, which are obviously still in the mix. But every day there was kind of a new news cycle around a different climate element of it, and it just kept building, as you said.
There was the break between, there was a decision to break off part of the whole Build Back Better agenda into the infrastructure bill,
That's right.
which was what you could get some Republicans, a few, to sign on to. And to me, it was very telling as far as climate and what you could get bipartisanship on climate. You could definitely get bipartisanship on dealing with adaptation and the effects of climate change. But you couldn't get that bipartisanship around mitigation, around things to address reducing fossil fuel emissions. And so that kind of was the split. And so the more difficult issues were saved for the reconciliation bill, which we're still waiting for.
Yeah, I wonder if either of you have perspective on how that split happened, because the infrastructure bill, the reconciliation bill got split up, moved individually, and then ultimately the infrastructure bill passed in a bipartisan way, as you said, Marianne. So I wonder if that, or if you heard anything from sources or realized anything in your coverage about maybe lessons that holds for how things can move in the Congress of today.
Well, I mean, I think there were House progressives who were saying these bills need to move together. Congresswoman Jayapal, who leads the House Congressional Progressive Caucus, was out in front saying that we can't separate these two because there's a real possibility that we're going to lose reconciliation if we only do infrastructure, and then we've lost kind of all of our political capital to move the second larger, more ambitious bill on climate. And that's exactly what happened, at least so far, in terms of reconciliation. So I think there's a real question as to whether that was the right approach, at least in the minds of some progressives.
And then you have to remember that Joe Manchin, the kingmaker, he was, in the bipartisan discussions, he was one of the leaders on the infrastructure bill. So, there was a thought, I think, from some that if, you kind of had to let him, get that win, and then maybe he'd come back and look favorably upon that process and want to do something in reconciliation. So, and here we are, obviously, and we still that hasn't borne fruit for Democrats yet, but Schumer and Manchin are talking. I'm sure we'll get more into the current conversation, but.
Let's talk a little more specifically about the budget reconciliation process. In particular, what I remember about the early days is that there were a lot of other issues in the mix, right? There was childcare, higher education stuff, healthcare costs. Like there was a lot of different issues being discussed, and it seems like many of those ultimately receded. Like they kind of one by one sort of fell back, and then climate remained a focus, it seemed, especially last fall. Is that your sense as well? And if so, why do you think that is? Or do you have any insights from the kinds of conversations you were having from your coverage?
I actually thought I did a story right after Manchin in December killed Build Back Better in its original form, where I felt like Democrats were taking a while to kind of like wrestle with these decisions that they faced over which policy areas to prioritize. And I think it's just become clear that this is now really, Democrats are frank, like Ro Khanna, House progressives have said. Whatever Joe Manchin, give him the pen, whatever he wants to do, let's do it. So, the things that are left are things that he has spoken favorably about or, said he wants to address, and the things that are off the table are things that Joe Manchin has no interest in doing. So clean energy tax credits, kind of consistent. I mean, Manchin could fit that into kind of his innovation-centric approach, all of the above. I mean, these tax credits, after a certain point would go out to technologies based on how much emissions they're reducing, so not to a specific technology, so that's all of the above. So it kind of fits into how Manchin thinks about things. Of course, Maxine mentioned the Clean Electricity Performance Program, so that's out. That's the one policy that you could say would actually have directly restrained fossil fuels. So yeah, I mean, I just think it became a matter of like, these are things that Manchin has spoken favorably about in a broad sense. And then of course, I do think climate, right, there's an urgency, a time sensitivity to it, and full Democratic control of Congress is not promised in the future. This could be the last chance in a decade, as Democrats like to say. So those are a few reasons, I think.
I think Josh said it best. It's Manchin. I mean, what they can get past Manchin and to some extent Sinema. They have this very tough situation with the 50 Senate, and that's really the reality that they're having to deal with. And I get the sense that they really do want to try to pass something by August, and they will whittle it down as much as they can to get those 50 votes.
Yeah, with the midterms coming up, how do you think that influences the conversation? Do you think that's adding urgency? Do you think that's stressing everybody out? Like, how's that playing into the overall climate discussion from what you're hearing?
I mean, I think it's definitely on everyone's minds. And I think there's kind of these two senses of urgency. One, there's this urgency with the science, right? We have to act. The science is telling us we have this very limited window to reduce emissions. And then there's the political urgency. We have to act in these however many months before November, when Democrats could lose control of one or both chambers of Congress and not be able to carry out this vision. So I think it is adding urgency, and it's a timely time to be having this panel when we're coming up against when Congress leaves town for the July 4th holiday, and then for the August recess, and then September 30th is kind of the final do or die deadline when reconciliation needs to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're seeing Democrats frame the urgency or the imperative to act on some sort of big legislative package on more like inflation grounds. I mean, that's clearly what is the predominant issue in this election. So you're seeing Democrats frame a potential package that includes clean energy tax credits as something that could help reduce prices over time. You're reducing exposure to volatile fossil fuel prices. So yeah, and I think there's a sense Democrats they feel like they've been on the defensive just given circumstance, and obviously this unprecedented combination of the pandemic and supply chain issues around that, and then Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I mean, they've done the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Some Democrats feel like they haven't leaned in enough to kind of what that meant and how big of a deal it was. So yeah, I think the urgency. I mean, of course, climate in itself is, Democrats say that they need to deal with this, as Maxine said, but I think there's also kind of an economic framing, how they feel like it could actually, help the current moment of high prices that is predominant on a lot of voters' minds right now.
Ironically, the way, the most obvious inflation thing people are dealing with is the gasoline prices. And the one issue that it seems pretty clear that Manchin does not want to have in the reconciliation bill is incentives for electric vehicles. And the Democrats could make an argument if they passed a big EV package that this is one of the things we're doing to address, to make you not dependent on what's happening in the world and be kind of tied to those gasoline prices, which we really have no control over by doing this big EV push. But this is something Manchin has been, pretty clear that he doesn't think the government intervened to build the infrastructure for gasoline-powered vehicles. It's very arguable. I think there's tons of government policy that really built out the gasoline-powered infrastructure we have, but he is not going to go along with that in this reconciliation package.
Yeah, it does. As you said, Josh, he's the kingmaker. It's all sort of coming down to Manchin. I wonder, since reconciliation is coming to a close in the next few weeks, months, one way or another, what are you hearing? So there's the EV stuff. Is there anything else that is being discussed as, yes, there's broad enough agreement that we expect this would be in there if they can come to an agreement? Are there things that are still the hang-ups? What's your sense of kind of the state of the package? And I know, of course, we can't predict we won't hold you to anything. But what's your sense of things right now?
I wanted to just quickly follow up on what Marianne was saying about the EV tax credit. I mean, I think it is still a little bit of an open question of if there's going to be some EV tax credit in there that doesn't look quite as broad and far-reaching as Senate Finance Chairman Ron Wyden has originally envisioned it as. I reported this earlier this week, or maybe it was last week, that there's probably going to be no extra credit for people who buy a union-made electric vehicle in America that was made in America. That extra union bonus might get dropped, but there could still be, and I don't read Manchin's mind or pretend to, but there could still be some form of EV credit in there. I just don't know what it would look like. I just know it would be much narrower. And then the methane, I guess it was originally called the methane fee. Now we're calling it the methane emissions reduction program. And Tom Carper, who chairs the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, every time I talk to him in the Senate basement, he's like, yeah, we're good on that. Seem to have reached agreement with Manchin on that. Obviously, that's one thing for him to say and another thing for him and his staff to negotiate in private with Manchin, but that seems to be in a good place from everything I'm hearing. And obviously, methane is a very potent, short-lived climate pollutant, as you all know. And then the clean energy tax credits, besides the EVs, seem to be in good shape. There was kind of bipartisan interest in them even, and Manchin was holding those bipartisan energy talks.
Yeah, I think it's unclear to me how granular the negotiations. I mean, it really is Schumer and Manchin. Like, I think they purposely have kind of closed things off. So it's a little bit frustrating as a reporter when you're kind of going around and approaching like rank and file Democrat, and I don't know, I feel like their guess is as good as anyone at this point. So I think it's still fairly high level. I'm sure staff, it's maybe more detailed, but yeah, I think Maxine listed a couple of the things that you would expect to still be in play. I agree. I think electric vehicles, I don't see how progressives would support a package that had nothing on electric vehicles, right? I feel like there's maybe a middle ground to be reached that isn't so pro-union, because Manchin has said he has a big auto maker, Toyota in West Virginia that's not unionized, so that probably explains some of his motivation there. And but I think the tax credits are, as Maxine said, in a broad sense, do make sense. Manchin has made clear his priorities are still around like promoting domestic fossil fuel production, and it's one thing I'm still trying to figure out. It seems hard to understand what exactly in reconciliation could do that, because there are specific rules on what can be in a reconciliation package, and a lot of things that you might imagine, I don't know, like more lease sales on public lands for oil and gas. Like, these are things that are administration prerogatives. So I don't know if it's like a handshake, you do things that I like on fossil fuels and maybe I'll support this, I don't know. So, but there are things in this tax package that you would think Manchin would be attracted to, and he's publicly supportive of, like a tax credit on carbon capture. Could be very helpful to power plants, fossil fuel plants in his state, and then manufacturing credits called 48C that would incentivize, factories built in former fossil fuel dependent areas to produce cleaner technology. So, yeah, I mean, there are things I think Democrats would say he could portray as a win. It's unclear on kind of what the mix is, though, at this point.
The other thing I'll add that Senator Whitehouse definitely wants to try to get included is this bill that he just introduced on border adjustments, border fee for.
We're familiar. Big fans here in the room.
It's a very different reaction than my editor. Border fee. So I don't have to explain to this audience what that is. He is going by the fact that Manchin has said he is, this is something that he understands would be positive for American manufacturers, et cetera. So it remains to be seen. I know that there is some industry support for the industries that think that they, like the cement maker Holcim thinks that it would be at a competitive advantage in the design that Senator Whitehouse has. But it's something that definitely is going to be, on the one hand, it looks like a win-win for unions and for, American manufacturers that do well on energy efficiency. But I am sure that it's going to be a very complex thing, and time is wasting. Probably if they don't get anything by August, that's going to be kind of the end of the line for the reconciliation package.
Sure, yeah, that makes sense. But likely not the end of the line for carbon border adjustments, because that's, folks in this room are well aware that the EU has their CBAM is coming.
Exactly.
I think January 2023 they start the reporting period, and so I know that that international pressure is starting to bear down. We hear that's on the minds of the lawmakers. I am curious about, since you mentioned the border adjustments, one thing that that we saw a lot of talk around the border adjustments was coming out of the bipartisan talks that Manchin was having for a few weeks. There seemed to be lots of positive Republican comments about border adjustments, and along the same lines of what you're saying, Mary Ann, like this would be, advantageous for American businesses who are already cleaner a lot of times than their international counterparts. I'm curious, did you, Josh or Maxine, did you guys have any conversations around that? Did you kind of hear that coming out of the bipartisan talks as well? Any perspective there?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the Hill coming out of the bipartisan talks, a lot of Republicans were really gung-ho about border carbon adjustment, Senator Kevin Cramer being among the kind of most vocal cheerleaders, I would say. I think the rub, and you all know this, so I don't need to womansplain it to you, but the rub obviously is that some Republicans don't want it to pair it with a domestic carbon tax, and that could complicate the WTO compliance, but that's maybe a future discussion.
Yeah, I've done a lot of reporting on the Republican side. I mean, there is an effort among kind of outside groups and consultants who want Republicans to really engage in this area, frame it around like almost, Trumpism, like populist trade, because they don't, I mean, that's the thing. Like, I know a lot of people really positive, like coming out of these meetings, carbon border is something we want to do, but there's just such a gulf, and it's very complicated. And like, what does a border carbon adjustment mean to each like side of this? I mean, it's just, it's very hard for me to see. Sorry to rain on the excitement here, but I just, I don't see how this could come together in reconciliation. I do think like politically, it's a very potent like issue that you're seeing both sides really have interest in, but a long way from, I mean, Republicans who I talk with, most of them don't even think that the U.S. needs to impose policies forget a carbon price, like that, that what you're actually measuring should just be based on like our carbon advantage from, the market, like our emissions reductions that have occurred like over the decades. Like they don't think it should be based on strengthening policy here. So yeah, hard to see like exactly how that comes together right now, just because there's disagreement on what exactly a carbon border adjustment looks like, and is it just a tariff if there's, if there's no domestic piece. So.
Right, that's what White House is designed to try to overcome this WTO issue, but that part of the design is the part that is going to be, very hard to sell because it means that domestic manufacturers who aren't efficient have to be subject to this fee, and it means that over time the fee has to become more stringent.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's okay to be cynical, Josh, about the, you're a reporter, you gotta, you gotta bring that. Right. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There's still a lot to sort out with the CBAM stuff. And so it would be a happy surprise if it came together in time for reconciliation. But yeah, I don't think that's not my sense either, that's like, going to resolve itself in time for reconciliation, but it's also a conversation that's not going away.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so I'll just toss out one more reminder to start getting your questions in. We're about ready to move to audience questions, but I have one more here on my list just to start to wrap up our portion. I'm curious, what has inspired you or encouraged you the most from your climate coverage over this busy period of climate policy discussion? I know at least from our side it's been really exciting to see the topic that we care so much about and that we work on, and have for years, to see it come so much into the spotlight in the last couple of years. That's been encouraging generally, but I wonder if there's anything in particular from the last couple of years that sticks in your mind. I know it's a rough couple of years to ask about optimism.
Obviously we want to keep the reporter hats on, so careful how I answer, but it's good to see like that it's a predominant topic, and that all, it seems like so many aspects of society feel like they need to come up with a policy to address climate, so that makes our jobs very interesting and active, and it's clearly a front and center issue, and that's just going to become more so. So for a reporter, that's exciting.
What I'll say has changed the most is that this belief kind of just all down the line that having to deal with reducing carbon emissions is an inevitability. The one thing that I'm writing about now is, it's not something on the Hill, but the NATO summit is coming up later this month, and for the first time NATO is going to have climate as part of its kind of strategic mission, because it's just inevitable that climate is part of what is causing the security issues that militaries around the world have to deal with. I mean, that is a huge change from when I began writing about this. Now, is NATO going far enough? It's not going to set any goals for militaries to decarbonize, although it is going to, put out a, guidance on what the militaries in the NATO alliance should be doing and could be doing, and what technology is there, kind of best practices and that sort of thing. So by no means are things moving as fast as the scientists say it needs to happen. But if you compare where things were just 10 years ago, it's pretty monumental shift. So it's sometimes hard to see that when you're looking at the things that haven't been achieved.
Yeah, and then I'll just say, and this is kind of a very reporter answer, but like from my perspective as a climate reporter, I haven't been doing this that long, but for the past 6 or 7 years, I've been covering climate, and it just feels like it's become one of the main topics that all reporters are covering now, which has been really cool to see. And the Washington Post is expanding its climate team and adding 20 new positions. The executive editor, Sally Busby, has said that climate is one of 3 areas that the Post is really going to prioritize for expansion over the coming year, in addition to health and wellness and technology. And it used to be that I would go in the Senate and ask a senator, you know, when is the Senate going to ratify the Kigali Amendment? And they just look at me blankly. And now I go, and there's a huge crowd around Manchin and Schumer and all the other Democrats asking questions about climate and clean energy. And so just anecdotally, but also through those real tangible steps, I've seen climate just become elevated in its profile as an issue for journalists, for politicians, for this administration. And it's been exciting to see.
Yeah, that is exciting. All right, well, I think we're ready for audience questions now.
Okay, we have quite a few.
All right.
One person asks, the keynote panelists from this morning mentioned the media as an industry that benefits from political polarization. How do each of you address polarization in your work, especially around climate action?
Starting off with an easy one. Thanks, John.
Well, I don't think the media, I think of the media as a monolithic industry, and certainly there are segments of the media industry that has really, you know, I think we all could name that make a point of, you know, it's part of their modus operandi to elevate polarization. So yes, for that segment of the media, but I think for any of us here, we're really not part of that industry that's that really has thrived on polarization. My publication is a nonprofit. We are funded by foundations that care about, you know, coverage of these issues. So that's really, we only benefit when there are people who care about hearing and explaining what's going on with climate change. So.
Yeah, I would very gently and politely push back on the premise of the question a little bit, in that you're right, Marianne, the media is not a monolith, and actually it can be newsworthy when people are disagreeing on different sides of the political spectrum. It can also be newsworthy when they're agreeing, and we saw that with the bipartisan energy talks that I know we all reported on in various capacities. It's not like we seek out conflict and try to kind of amp that up to make it some sensationalist story. We report the news, and sometimes there's conflict, sometimes there's agreement, and that makes it into the pages of our publications.
What do you find to be the easiest and most difficult parts of reporting on climate issues?
Wait, who's speaking? Sorry.
Oh, it's John back here in the back.
Can you say it again? I'm just not hearing it.
He asked, what do you find to be the easiest and the most difficult parts of climate reporting?
I would say it's been difficult to cover the Manchin-Schumer talks because they're intentionally not negotiating in public. And it's very different from what we saw last year when the White House and lawmakers were talking openly or more openly about their negotiations over Build Back Better, and then it spectacularly imploded in a very public way, and you had the White House statement singling out Manchin and Manchin bristling at that, and now a lot is happening behind closed doors, and even as a reporter with relationships on both sides of the aisle with staff and lawmakers on Capitol Hill, it can be honestly really challenging to figure out exactly what the state of play is and what's going on, but we do our best to figure it out and to communicate that to readers.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say let's start with the hardest I mean, I just feel like there's so much ground, there's so much territory, so many angles you can pursue, and yeah, I mean, you know, you have a limited staff. I mean, before I was at the Washington Examiner, I was the only climate energy reporter, so definitely different at Politico where there's 8 or 9 of us, but just, you know, deciding how to use your resources and, you know, when to, you know, do an on-the-ground type kind of like impact story, which I haven't had a chance to do a ton of at Politico. So just kind of figuring out what stories to tell in a competitive environment, and easiest part of it, I just think there's so many branches off, just like the administration has framed climate around, you know, the economy. I mean, there's just so many you know, ways you can relate to your audience, I think, in underscoring why this issue is important and explaining it. And yeah, you know, haven't covered climate very long either. I don't know, 4 years at this point. So yeah, but I think you could bring in kind of just natural like ability to tell a story and you know, highlight you know, the urgency of something. I mean, I think can go across beats. So it was something that I thought was pretty easy to kind of get into, even if you're not super, you know, knowledgeable on the science right away or what. I mean, you can easily learn that. And I feel like people on this beat are very open to teaching you. And there's so many resources, different analysts to talk with and reports to read. So much information available.
Yeah, I would say the easiest part, or the thing that I like about it, is that you're always learning something new. It's always, again, it's just so multifaceted. To me, the hardest part is that there's such a level of complexity to it. Just talking about we were just talking in our office about covering the border adjustment this morning, and you know, I'm really urging them to you know, send somebody out to show like the process of cement and how it's, you know, very carbon intensive, and why it's, even if you put up a whole bunch of solar panels, it's still going to be carbon intensive, because it's not just the energy, it's the chemical reaction. And so it can get so complex that it becomes very nerdy. And so that is a problem. So we want to make sure that, you know, we stay in touch with the people who are involved, like the workers and the people who care about these things, and make sure that the stories aren't devoid of people and don't go too heavily into the technical part and the science. So that's it, to me, having that balance between the human element and the technical element is the most difficult part.
Sure. All right, John, next question.
Yeah, another question. How can young people coming out of college prepare to cover climate policy well in the future?
Cover it as in reporting on it? Yeah. Like a future reporter, is that what you mean?
All I got is what I said.
I think that's how I would interpret it, like if they wanted to go into this field. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, as Maxine described what the Washington Post's doing, I mean, I just think it's one of the beats where there's a lot of opportunity. So yeah, I know it doesn't feel like the media is like on a down spiral when you're in DC. I know we're lucky to be in this market and be at publications that are, Politico's the same. That's one of our top priorities. So yeah, plenty of opportunity. And so I just would say don't hesitate or kind of fall into the media, is polarized and has negative public opinion, whatever. Just kind of put your head down, do the work. I moved here from Florida, had very little experience. I was working at small town newspaper. If I were to tell you how I got here, I couldn't even just kind of a unusual path. So you just do the work, work hard, meet the right people, be curious.
Yeah, I started out at E&E News before going to the Washington Post, and I think they do fantastic work. For those of you not familiar, trade publication now owned by Politico, and really gets into the weeds, into the policy in a deeper way than some of the publications like the Post, frankly, that write for a broader layperson audience that's not really nerdy about climate policy, which can be a good place to get your start and nerd out with the policy folks and really get to know the policy that way. And yeah, I would say, honestly, all reporters to some extent in the future are going to have to be climate reporters in some way, right? If you're covering health, obviously there's a really strong nexus between environmental inequities and health impacts with air pollution, lead pipes exposure, it goes on and on. If you're an economic reporter covering inflation and gas prices and what President Biden is doing on it while still trying to balance his climate goals. So I would say even if you're not a reporter who considers climate their beat, there are ways to just imbue it in all of your coverage because it's all so interconnected.
For sure.
Okay, there are a lot of climate stories that are very heavy and overwhelming. How can we encourage and provide reporters with content about our work for a great solution?
Did you guys hear him okay?
Could you
Yeah,
repeat
Yeah,
Kinda.
yeah, can you repeat that?
I will repeat that. There are a lot of climate stories that are very heavy and overwhelming. How can we, CCLers, encourage and provide reporters with content about our work for a great solution?
So how much should they email you to say, we're meeting with Congress, we're trying to fix it, do a story about us?
I see.
Not you specifically necessarily, but maybe any tips for, working in their local markets, like what advice for maybe approaching a newspaper or a TV reporter in their hometown, anything that you think particularly is newsworthy or interesting about what we're doing here?
We often have a discussion in our newsroom about what's called solutions journalism, which a lot of us are very skeptical about. And probably a lot of the journalists that you'll come across have some skepticism about anything being called a solution because there is no magic bullet, and often when reporting is kind of aimed at showing something as a solution, that is the story that will get, that won't wear well over time, like the 60 Minutes story on the Bloom box that was supposed to be a solution. Probably you guys are too young or cold fusion to go back even further. But so I'm not sure that I would sell what you're doing as a solution, but to me, the human interest that you care so much to spend your time. It's the journey, not the end, that I would talk about, and how you really became so engaged in this issue that you're actually doing the really difficult thing of talking to politicians who aren't as engaged in this issue. To me, that's more of a human interest story than to say that this is the solution, because we don't know if, I think we're going to get there very incrementally, if at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great advice. I always encourage our volunteers to think about exactly that, the human interest angle of, who in your chapter is doing this because they're a parent or they're a small business owner and they're worried about how, things are impacting their business or the local economy, or who's a middle schooler who's going to go talk to Congress for the first time, things like that. Like, that is such an interesting and beautiful thing, I think, about what we do. That's an angle worth pursuing.
I was talking to a guy last week who, again, for my military story, who was a Vietnam veteran who is involved with, this was on the side. He just happened to mention he's involved with Citizens Climate Lobby, but it's because he was, exposed to Agent Orange, and it got very involved in environmental issues and his whole story is like fascinating. And, I'm not going to write a story on him as a CCL lobbyist, but I am going to write about, this engagement on military and environmental issues, and how these former veterans, these veterans are kind of a driving force in pushing us to look more closely at the environmental impact of the military.
Yeah, interesting. And it goes back to what you were saying before about always trying to balance between the human side of the climate story and the nerdy data technological side of it. It's like there's plenty of information out there, but if we can add some heart and some humanness to it, that's helpful too. All right, John, you got another question for us back there?
Yes. What question about reversing climate change would be most relevant and most difficult for a politician who wanted to dodge the question?
Can you say the beginning part of the question again?
What question about reversing climate change would be most relevant and difficult for a politician to dodge?
Oh, what question about reversing climate change would be most difficult for a politician to dodge?
I don't know that anything's difficult for a politician to dodge.
Spin off anything,
Yeah, I once asked
They're pros.
Senator John Hickenlooper, I'm calling out someone now, as he was getting into an elevator in the Capitol, so does reconciliation need to happen by July 4th? And he was like, yes, I am planning to have a good July 4th, and the doors closed.
Oh my, I feel like I was there.
You were there, yeah. So they can find a way for it.
That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
Deliberately mishear something.
Yeah, you sometimes encounter challenges with, I've covered the Republican side a lot, and the House Republicans, I know both of us report on their kind of, they have there's a task force that Kevin McCarthy set up that has that they presented as an agenda of here's buckets, policy buckets of, where we think we should be prioritizing. And we kind of said point blank in our story, there's no new policy here. There's nothing that would actually address mitigation of fossil fuel, reducing fossil fuel use or demand. So you get I got comments from Republicans, staffers, how could you say that? The policies are still to come, but you presented this as a policy agenda, there's no escaping that this is the facts of what's there. So I mean, yeah, they'll, find a way, politicians will find a way to say, well, hey, who's to say the Democratic policies won't just raise energy prices, whatever. They'll come up with something else. But yeah, I think it's becoming harder for certain politicians to defend, solutions that aren't really new or attempting to get at the problem.
Now, speaking of the task force's plan that they recently put out, what do you make of the fact that our sense was that it came out earlier than it was expected? It was a little bit rushed. What's your sense of that, the timing around it, or motivation for it, or anything? Have you had conversations that shed any light on that? Like, why now, and why engage in that way? Because as you said, if they're not getting really specific.
I mean, I think it was always, it was a year in the making. I mean, it was something that Republicans identified. Kevin McCarthy, the top House Republican, identified as this is a vulnerability, for the party. We need an agenda designed specifically for the midterms. So the timing is, the midterms are pretty close, and they did kind of retroactively position it also as, our policy solutions will, promote domestic oil and gas production to deal with high energy prices. So they've kind of now tied it to that issue. I mean, actually, Garrett Graves, who's the top Republican on that task force, actually, it took for him a while in the conversation I had with him in an interview to even acknowledge that this was a set of climate policies. It was more like, this is our plan to deal with high energy prices. So that switch was somewhat interesting and revealing. But yeah, I mean, I think the reason it's coming out at all and out now is aspects of the party see that they need an agenda, and the public, we'll see if specific demographics like young people, suburban voters, actually see what they've put out as a real solution.
Yeah, I've been told by Republican strategists that this was a way for Republicans to not just be against what Democrats are for, but to be for something themselves, and that polling indicates that younger voters especially care about climate as an issue and want Republicans to be a little bit more engaged on this issue, and not just saying, we don't like this, we don't like that, but here's what we're for, not just against. And then in terms of the timing, my understanding is that Kevin McCarthy has task forces for a whole bunch of issues, not just energy, conservation, and climate, and those will all be kind of rolling out their plans before the midterms to show voters, here's what we're for, and here's why you should vote for us.
Makes sense. Sure, clap for that. All right, John.
Some people have questioned whether the House Republican climate plan should be reported as a climate plan if it wouldn't significantly reduce emissions. How do you deal with that kind of nomenclature question in your reporting?
I think we just talked about that. I mean, do you have anything else you want to say on that?
I didn't write our story on that. My colleague, just did a great job on it. And he said, this is a Republican climate plan that would, enable a lot more fossil fuel production. The way he wrote it was very good. And I really, the timing of this plan is a lot. Every member of the House is running for re-election. They're going to be in their districts. They're going to be talking to voters. Inevitably, some of these voters are going to ask them, well, are you doing anything on climate? And if anyone asks them, they now have a plan they can point to. And I think, you're going to hear a lot of pointing to natural gas as a solution, as opposed to coal, that sort of thing. And there may be, a bit of concern that you just can't say no, or you can't just say. So if you want to applaud, I think it's moving from the out and out denial that really was out of style even before Trump took office, but had kind of a resurgence under him.
I think.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
I was just going to say I did have a story where I did put climate plan in the headline and took some heat for it on Twitter. And I think I would stand by that headline. Obviously, editors write the headline, not journalists, but I think it is fair to say that they did put out a plan, and it's also fair to question whether it was a sufficient plan. And the story, pretty high up, did note that the plan didn't set a target for reducing emissions and didn't have any new policies per se around climate or clean energy, but was just more of a broad kind of list of 6 kind of areas where there's broad support across the Republican House caucus on climate conservation and energy. So I think it's fair to call it a plan. I also think it's fair to question whether it's adequate to meet the moment on climate.
Yeah, they can call it a climate plan, but that name doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's a good plan or that it's an effective plan.
Yeah, but the only one thing, I mean, Maxine said it perfectly, but also I had some Democrats kind of say, well, why cover this at all? Like, I definitely disagree with that. It's still, it's a development. I mean, it's hard to imagine, 10 years ago, whatever, that the House Republicans would feel any need to put out a plan that they're presenting as a climate plan, at least in part in the name of the task force. So as long as you're providing all the facts on what's in it, what's not in it, I definitely would push back on anyone who say it's not something that the media should cover.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Definitely worth coverage. And I've heard our Danny Richter, our Vice President of Government Affairs, talk about a future that we're working toward here is where the parties can be working together on climate, can be passing climate legislation in a bipartisan way regularly, lots of climate policy. That's the future we want to see. And if you work back from that, there has to be a step at some point that looks like this, where they're starting to put out plans, they're starting to test the water, they're starting to feel that pressure and say, oh, we need to engage, we need to have an answer. So we'll start here. There has to be a step like this along the way to that future that we're trying to get to. So I think we've got 5-ish minutes left. So John, maybe one more question?
Maybe the last question. Progressives and conservatives lean into different styles of language when discussing politics and climate policy. How do you walk the line of using neutral language in your reporting?
That's a great question.
I think language is constantly evolving, right? And I do what the copy editors at the Washington Post tell me to write for the accepted phrase, but the accepted phrase is constantly evolving and changing, and we update our style book regularly to reflect that. But so as an example, I use the term natural gas in my stories. So does everyone else at the Post who covers energy. There are some climate activists who want us not to call it natural because they think that's a term that the industry has co-opted to present it as a cleaner fuel option than it really is. And the Post has an updated style book to say fossil gas, but if it did, then I would write that. So I hope that's kind of a helpful example.
So, some of the terms that I think have evolved, we will use the term climate crisis, but I think at some point, the New York Times definitely was not using that. I don't know if they've changed their view on that. We always are talking about the words around climate denial, because I personally don't like labeling anyone like something as simple as a denier, because it's usually more nuanced. But it's very hard in a headline. It's very, very hard in a small, the little room that you have. To me, that's the hard thing. Is you don't have a lot of space to go into the detail that's really behind somebody's position, and so. We think a lot about these things, and we definitely in the editing process we go back and forth over these little nuances in the language.
The one thing I would add is, I do have reporting experience in conservative media, if you want to call it that, or publications that are considered their editorial is right of center. I feel like it's covering climate change has become less politicized, at least from a reporter perspective. Actually, when I first started on the beat at the Examiner, the reporter before me had to write like the majority of scientists say, or something, like before he could just say anything on emissions or climate change. I personally haven't encountered anything like that in my reporting. I've just approached it. From the facts as that are known, and Politico I know is more of an actual like style book, just like the Post, and we have copy editors. I didn't have that level of editing in previous stops, but was able to just kind of cover things as I saw it without any of that pushback. And I know there's some really good reporters who I see in the Capitol now, including with like the Washington Times, who do really good work. And from my conversations with that reporter, they're also not getting a lot of kind of interference. So that's one observation I'd have in my personal experience.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for your time, your thoughtful questions. Let's give them another round of applause. And I think now we have a 15-minute break before the next round of breakouts. Thanks again.